to see everybody here so promptly. I'm going to start with land acknowledgement. On behalf of the Seattle Planning Commission, we'd like to actively recognize that we are on Indigenous land, the traditional and current territories of the Coast Salish people who have lived on and stewarded these lands since the beginning of time and continue to do so today. Land acknowledgement because Native land was taken by force and colonized to form the United States as we know it today. Through this process, which is ongoing through systematic oppression, Native identity, history, and land ownership has been ignored by colonizers and attempted to be erased. Land acknowledgement is the first step in opposing the systematic oppression and historic erasure of Native people and Native land ownership. All right, and we have announcements now. Welcome to members of the public and visitors. We are happy to make all commission meetings open to the public. Please note that the Planning Commission does not hold public hearings since we are an advisory body. We provide recommendations to the elected leaders who then in turn make the actual decisions. We encourage individuals and organizations to provide their comments appropriately to elected officials. And this meeting is obviously in a hybrid format with some of us here in the boards and commissions room at Seattle City Hall and some people participating remotely. We'll move on to the color brave space norms. This is something we bring up at the beginning of each meeting to pull one out and reflect on it as to the meaning of the topics that we're talking about today. And I'm gonna call on somebody randomly in the room. I'm gonna call on somebody in the room today. Matt, you just arrived. Are you feeling ready to pull one of these out and tell us how you think it relates to what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'd like them to up there.
Now you have to memorize them.
Yeah, that was a test. I think let's keep focused on our collective goal. I liked our meeting last week was really productive, and I think we've all read over the materials, hopefully, from last meeting and can move forward, keep working on making like concise recommendations for our upcoming letter.
Right. If there are no amendments or modifications, I suggest we agree to these norms for today. On the agenda today, we have a long meeting, but only one item, which is a working session on the proposed changes to the neighborhood residential development standards and proposed changes to zoning in order to implement the comprehensive plan. But before we do that, we do need to approve our minutes from the October 24th, 2024 Planning Commission meeting. A motion and a second to approve. Okay. Andy moves and Zio seconds. All right. Speedy business here in person in the boards and commissions room. All of those in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? With that, the meeting minutes from October 24th are approved. We'll move now on to the chair's report. So this is where we talk about upcoming meetings. We're using our next Land Use and Transportation Committee meeting, which is scheduled for November 21st from 7:30 to 9 a.m. What are we using that meeting for? That's that. Sorry.
Sorry.
It's okay.
That will be a continuation of today's conversation.
Okay.
Focusing on the proposed zoning maps.
Okay. So as we talked about several meetings back, all of the meetings that we're having, including committee meetings, are a continuation and a cumulative discussion based off of what we talked about at the last meeting. So if you don't normally attend these committee meetings, I do encourage you to attend if you want to continue to shape the recommendations that we're developing. The meeting will be held in a hybrid format using the MS Teams platform. And then our next full commission meeting is scheduled for Thursday, December 12th from 3 to 5:30 p.m. That meeting will be held in a hybrid format with options for meeting in person in the boards and commissions room here or using the MS Teams platform online. That brings us to Vanessa's announcement and commission business.
Thanks, Michaela. As noted before, we have some commissioners participating here in the Boards and Commissions room of City Hall and some participating online by MS Teams. There will be opportunities for commissioners to ask questions and provide comment. For those commissioners joining us online, please put your name in the chat function of MS Teams. For those commissioners in the room that may not have your laptop, please take your name stand thing and thank you and put it upright. And I will do my best to help make sure everybody's recognized in order. I will read public comment emailed to me prior to this meeting, or I would have done so, but I have received no public comment. So we won't be needing to cover public comment unless somebody joins us here in the Boards and Commissions room as the meeting gets underway. We do have a member of the public joining us. Thank you for joining us. And if you decide towards the end of the meeting that you'd like to say something, feel free to sign up on the clipboard there and we'll call on you. I would like to remind commissioners to plan on attending at least one of the comprehensive plan open houses. Could you please forward? I think I've got them up on this screen. So as you know, there we go. There have been several comp plan meetings thus far. A number of you have been able to attend. Thank you so much for that. There are currently no commissioners signed up for next week's District 4 open house at Magnuson Park Hangar number 30. I will be there and I would love some company. So if you're inclined to join me, please let me know. We also do have commissioners signed up for the Jefferson Park Community Center open house on December 5th, the Seattle Center Armory on December 10th, and then the virtual info session on December 12th. The reason why we're asking commissioners to attend at least one of these meetings is to gather a firsthand sense of how OPCD is engaging community members and general comments and questions that are coming up at these community meetings. I'd like to pause for a moment and just ask if there are any impressions from commissioners who have attended the meetings thus far that you care to share with the group. It's not necessary, but would be happy to hear if there are any. I'll just note that based on last fall's round of open houses, OPCD has been planning for really large turnout and hasn't really had the huge turnout that they expected, but they've had good turnout. So I believe yesterday's meeting, was it yesterday or the day before? Yeah, last night's meeting was pretty well attended. John, you were at that, correct?
Yeah, OPCD staff said that was the best attended so far of the three. It was at Nathan Hale High School.
So
I had a comment
great, jump in.
on the meeting. So the one at Washington Hall that I saw several of my fellow commissioners at. I was talking to Nick Welch for a while with OPCD and talking to him about neighborhood centers and kind of trying to understand the thought process there, how they approach neighborhood centers and their upzoning and what they were looking to get out of the changes they were proposing. And one point that he made was just that pretty universally, not everywhere, but their default residential upzone in those areas was to go to a low-rise 3, and which is 5 stories, which is a good amount of height. But just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention. That kind of the 5-story is the default residential in many of these neighborhood centers, and then there's an immediate drop off adjacent to that to in our zone, which is several stories lower and more of a townhouse level 3-story scenario. So there's some discussions follow up that I'm sure we'll get into about kind of transitions and if it's appropriate to discuss transitions. But it was a good conversation with Nick Welch, and we can talk about a little bit more about it later.
Great. Thanks, Dylan. Any other impressions that anyone would like to share for now? Matt.
You're on mute, Matt.
There we go. I attended the one at Madison Middle School. I saw Theo there, and it was not particularly well attended. There was probably it was about 1-to-1 staff to public. So
The election.
I got yeah, it was the election night, so maybe people were somehow preoccupied, but it wasn't the barn burner that we've had in years past.
I did have a similar conversation to Dylan's about the frequent transit zoning and how there's a similar drop off basically two parcels in off of these roads that goes down to neighborhood residential and like the appropriateness of that across the neighborhood. Yeah, similarly, we can talk about it more.
Great. Thank you. Love that. Anybody else? Michaela?
Yeah, I also attended, so I was at the one at Washington Hall with Dylan and Cecilia, and Olivia was there. Again, it was really sparsely attended. And it was mostly folks that I know from different advocacy or stakeholder groups. I found it was a really, really helpful experience to be able to ask questions of city staff. And so just wanted to publicly acknowledge their openness to engaging in pretty deep dialogue with individual community members to make sure that they had grounding and understanding where the city was coming from. My district representative was not there, council representative was not present. The mayor was not there, but the mayor did send a woman from his staff who's been leading the comp plan work on his behalf. And so I also had an opportunity to talk to her and got to ask questions of staff around parking minimums, what's possible there. Got to better understand how they're thinking about concentrating a lot of the denser housing along arterials, the corridor strategy. So I can offer some information there. And then also got to talk to them about this transition concept around the neighborhood centers. Again, and the food was really good and it was catered by Central Kitchen. So shout out to Central Kitchen for catering a really great open house bread.
Excellent. Thank you, Michaela. I'm looking around the room just to see if there are any other comments from anybody that I might have missed. All right. Well, again, I encourage those of you who might not have had a chance to attend one of these to do so and to let me know. So I can be looking out for you, or Olivia or John can be looking out for you. I would, one administrative detail that I do want to share with everybody is that one of our staff, Robin McGonigal, is on medical leave for an injury to her hand. And so her hours are very limited, somewhere around 4 hours a week. So I would just ask anytime any of you are emailing Robin to please copy Olivia, John, or myself, just so that we can ensure that we're getting back to you. Except for the replies. She wants to stay on top of the replies for the meetings, so no need to copy us. But please also bear with Olivia, John, and I as we try to fill her big shoes in how she supports this commission. So, and I will update you on that when she comes off her medical leave. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michaela for introductions.
Okay. And we are, where are we on the agenda? We're not doing public comment.
No public comment.
All right. Well,
So far.
wonderful. Well, we do introductions, popcorn style. I can get us started. Please give your name, your pronouns, where you live, and what you do for a living, and pass it on to someone else. So my name's Michaela Daffern. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Capitol Hill, although maybe according to the zoning maps, I'm technically in Miller Park. And I work in affordable housing policy and planning. And my co-chair is not here, so I will pass it to the first person I see in the room, which is Lauren.
Everybody, Lauren Squires, she, her. I live by the Mount Baker Light Rail Station, and I work at King County Metro as the Connecting to Transit program lead. Yeah. Sue Alvarez, she, they pronouns. I live in White Center Highland Park, and I'm a designer with Element Architects done and stuff.
Matt Malloy, he, him pronouns. I live in Green Lake, Roosevelt neighborhood, and I work at the Queen Anne Beer Hall and substitute teach. And Last Commissioner Andrew in the room.
Andy Dannenberg, he, him, Northeast Seattle, and I teach at University of Washington in public health and urban planning. And online.
Anybody else? So Dylan Glasecki.
Hey, y'all. He, him pronouns. I live in the Central District, Squire Park, Cherry Hill area. I'm an architect and urban designer with Perkins Eastman, and I think that hits everything. Let's see, Cecilia.
Hi, Cecilia, she, her pronouns. I live next to the Roosevelt Light Rail Station, and I'm a community organizer at Disparate Washington and work with people with disabilities around housing and transportation. And I will pass it to Caleb.
Hi everyone, Caleb Toolday, he, him pronouns. I live in Beacon Hill and I'm an educator at Rainier Scholars. I will pass it to Nick.
Hello, Nick Whipple. I use he, him pronouns. I live in West Seattle in the North Delridge neighborhood. And for my day job, I'm a planner on the east side. How about Monica?
Hey everyone, my name is Monica Sharma. I use she, her pronouns. I live in the Central District and I work in advocacy and organizing for equity in youth sports and physical activity. And I will pass it to Deanna.
Good afternoon, Diana Quintanar, she, her pronouns. I live in Capitol Hill, and for my day job, I'm a multimodal transportation planner. And pass it over to whoever hasn't gone.
How about Dylan S?
Hello everyone, my name is Dylan Stevenson. I use he, they pronouns. I live in Belltown and I teach in the Urban Design and Planning Department at UW, and I will pass it along to Matt Hutchins.
Hi, I'm Matt Hutchins. I use he, him pronouns. I live in West Seattle, and I am an architect. And I think, am I the last one?
You are the last commissioner.
All right. Well, then I'll hand it over to staff then.
All right.
Sure, I'll start. Hi, everyone. Olivia Baker. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm staff to the Planning Commission. John?
Hi everyone, I'm John Hoy, staff to the Planning Commission. I use he, him pronouns. Vanessa.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vanessa Murdoch. I use she, her pronouns. I too am staff to the commission. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon. And I'm tempted to pull the shades down because the sun is glaring, but that just seems so not okay to do. So if those of us in the room are squinting, it's because we're getting as much vitamin D as we can. And with that, I will turn it back over to Mikhail.
All right, I'm just checking in to see if we now have anybody signed up for public comment. Okay. We have two opportunities. Oh, doing right now.
Possibility, sure.
It will be fine. Okay, thank you. So with that, I will move us to our working session part of the meeting on the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan update. So we're setting aside the balance of the meeting to discuss materials released in mid-October related to the comprehensive plan, which is the proposed neighborhood residential development standards and proposed zoning maps to implement the One Seattle plan. I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa to provide an overview of the timeline and process. We have, just to make a special note, is this you now to say this or is this me?
I'll say it.
Okay.
Thank you. No, I wasn't very clear in my notes. So we are taking the rest of the meeting to as a working session to talk about the materials that were released in mid-October. I'm going to go over our timeline for developing our comments. And then also want to note that We won't necessarily, we have up until 5:30. However, if we wrap up the conversation before then, we can adjourn early, but we do have the time set aside. Olivia, do you mind advancing, please, to the next slide? So the slides you see in front of you details our meeting schedule that started, well, our meetings have been going on all year. However, we started talking about the materials released regarding the comp plan in mid-October. And so we've had 4 meetings, and you'll see on the screen, we had a 30-minute, very high-level update on the on the proposals. Then we took the meeting on the 24th to be briefed by staff from the Office of Planning and Community Development on the preferred growth strategy, neighborhood residential development standards, and zoning maps. We then discussed the growth strategy last Tuesday, and we discussed neighborhood residential development standards last Thursday. We are currently November 14th, just in case we forgot what the date was. We're in a working session. And then we really only have a few meetings following that to complete our conversation around the zoning maps, start to pull together a letter, discuss the first draft of that letter on the 5th of December, have a final discussion on the final letter on the 12th. And I'm proposing we hold a special meeting on the 17th of December in order to approve that letter in time for the December 20th deadline. Currently, we only have 6 commissioners who have committed to the December 17th meeting. It will be a short meeting. It will be online, although you're more than welcome to come in person if you'd like to. It will be held here in City Hall from 8:30 in the morning until 9 in the morning. And the intent of that meeting is really just a final approval. So not really taking any final edits. The time for final edits will be at our December 12th full commission meeting, which is our next full commission meeting. So please do let me know if you are available on the 17th of December so that I can notice the meeting and that we can stick with this schedule. If right now we only do have 6 commissioners and we need quorum, so we need 9 commissioners to attend that meeting in order to approve the letter.
And is that at 8:30 I wrote down, is that correct?
8:30 a.m.
To
Okay.
9.
to 9 a.m.
The other meetings are mostly the 7:30?
The other meetings are, you should have on your calendars, so they are the 7:30. All the meetings on the slide right now are 7:30 a.m. to 9 a.m., with the exception of today's, which is 3 to 5:30, and December 12th, which is 3 to 5:30 as well. Lauren?
Yeah, I'll confirm my attendance for the 17th as a follow-up, but last time we talked about timeline, I put something in my schedule, and on that week of approving our letter, I just have a note that that's when the mayor is going to transmit a comp plan to council. So could you speak to any shifting of the schedule of mayor, council, like where we're trying to hit?
So the deadline for comments on the proposed zoning maps and the proposed neighborhood residential development standards is December 20th.
Okay.
The mayor, I have been told, the mayor will be transmitting his proposed One Seattle comprehensive plan that was released this spring as a draft. He will be transmitting that to council for their review and approval late December. So I don't know if that's going to be the week of the 17th or the week after that. Council will then take the first 4 to 5 months of 2025 to dig into the mayor's proposed plan. And that will be our opportunity, the Planning Commission's opportunity, to engage with council over around the mayor's proposed plan. How our first take will be to review the proposed plan and see how it responds to our comment letter that we released in April. So while all of these things are related to the comp plan, the deadline that we have for the 20th is specific to comments on the neighborhood residential development standards and proposed zoning maps.
For this 250, you take it or leave it.
Hi, Cody. Okay, that's helpful for me. I just, need to process a little bit that is it accurate that I'm kind of understanding that we are commenting on neighborhood residential development standards in the future land use map or the zoning that implements the growth strategy that will be outlined in the comp plan ahead of the draft of the comp plan?
That is correct.
Yes.
Okay.
So so the draft of the comp plan was released by the mayor in spring of this year.
Uh-huh.
You all rolled up your sleeves, put together a fabulous, comprehensive, no pun intended, letter that was shared with the mayor and city staff and council. And the plan that the mayor will be transmitting to council at the end of this year, by the end of December, is his proposed plan based on comments received on the draft that he released in the spring. So part of the reason why we are taking a look at the neighborhood residential development standards and the zoning maps now in advance of release of the mayor's proposed plan is to stay on track, to stay on schedule to approve those zoning maps and neighborhood residential development standards in time to meet the deadline imposed by State House Bill HB 1110.
Okay, so that's why they're two kind of separate work streams, but very much related, that the zoning maps have to meet a state deadline that maybe the comp plan isn't.
The comp plan technically needs to be, by state law, needs to be adopted by the end of this year.
Okay, got it.
Highly unlikely that will happen because the council has established a committee of the whole, which means it's all council members, similar to the select budget committee. And they will be reviewing the plan that is transmitted to them at the end of, by the end of December. They will be taking the first couple months of next year to better understand the plan, how it relates to the neighborhood residential development standards, how it relates to the zoning maps.
Okay. Thank you.
The timing is a little challenging to track.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna need this explanation every time.
No, that's great.
Can you, for me to understand, at what point will we see a response to the feedback that we provide on the neighborhood residential legislation and zoning maps?
That is an excellent question for me to ask OBCD
Okay.
because I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I still don't understand.
I don't know the exact date, but I believe based on what I've read in the materials for this release, there's going to be 2 stages of the draft zoning going to council as well, separate from the mayor's final plan going to council, happening, I think part of it was in March perhaps, and then another batch in like May or June. So I think you would see the mayor's response to any comments in this cycle, probably in that March timeframe when it goes to council. That would be my guess.
We will confirm that. Thank you, Olivia. I think that's accurate. We just want to make sure it's accurate.
Anybody online have any process questions before we move on? No, but Vanessa, I am saying that Matt committed to attending the meeting on December 17th. Do you want to pause to harvest any other RSVPs right now?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm seeing Matt. Thank you, Matt Hutchins and Lauren. So that brings our number up to 8, and we need 1 more for quorum. So thank you, and please let me know. Oh, and Cecilia, boom. Thank you. There we are. There we have it. So as I noted before, we will be noticing this meeting as a public meeting. So the notice will go out in compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act, at least 24 hours in advance. As a practice, we tend to give more notice than that, more along the lines of 48 hours. It will be a short meeting. I will reiterate, it'll be from 8:30 to 9, online and in person here in City Hall if you choose to come in person. And I will follow up with a specific meeting request or meeting appointment that you can put in your calendar. So thanks all for that.
Can I just recommend that you perhaps reiterate our public comment policy? We've had a few folks join us online since we started the meeting.
Thank you. So we take public comment at 2 points in our meetings, at the beginning of our meeting and at the end of our meeting. We've now moved beyond the first portion of public comment and we'll be taking public comment at the end of our meeting, which could be as late as 5:25, and it could be before that if we wrap up our working session in advance. Typically, we ask for people to email me so that I can read the public comment during the public comment period. You're also more than welcome to join us here in City Hall in the Boards and Commissions room and provide public comment, which an individual might do towards the end of this meeting. If there is somebody on the meeting that would care to email a public comment, I will put my email in the chat and you can email and I can then read it during the public comment period of the meeting. Any other questions? I try to multitask. All right. So I just want to give a brief overview of, per the schedule you all see in front of you, we have a limited number of meetings to digest a lot of information and develop consensus amongst the commission to put into a comment letter. As such, the development of this letter will be less iterative than past processes have been. We don't have the luxury of time to revisit decisions made at previous meetings. Staff will be sending out recaps of each of these meetings after they occur so that those commissioners who are unable to attend can be caught up to speed and know where we are. Our strategy that we discussed at one of the meetings last week of how to approach our comments is to be fairly high level, especially when it comes to the zoning maps. And instead of going through and commenting on each zoning map, commissioners will be developing suggested criteria that can guide establishment of these neighborhood centers across the city in a consistent and equitable manner. Next slide, please. Okay. So at last Tuesday's meeting, we talked about a light touch on the preferred growth strategy because we will have more time as City Council reviews the mayor's plan in the next few months in the first few months of 2025. We'll be able to provide a more robust discussion on the preferred growth strategy as it relates to other elements in the plan, which we haven't seen yet. We're going to be focusing on the zoning changes in the neighborhood residential zones and proposed zoning maps. And as I mentioned, looking for themes and overarching suggestions. Early thoughts on the format for the letter is to be less text heavy than, say, for example, our letter on the draft comp plan was. A fantastic letter, to all of your credit, and quite dense. And so our thought for this letter is to really explore different formats for the letter that are a little bit more approachable and are organized by categories. So both for city staff as well as for members of the public who really want to understand where we're coming from, they can zone in on the category that they're most interested in. We've compared the Planning Commission's recommendations on the growth strategy from the draft comp plan earlier this spring to outcomes in the preferred growth strategy. So some positive changes that we've seen: an increase in FAR, a bonus for stacked flats, improvements to affordable housing bonuses. The commission's, or at least in the meetings that we held last week, commissioners continued to raise concerns around the concentration of density along arterials. And an important point that was made over the course of last week's meetings is that not all arterials are the same. So living adjacent to I-5 or a freight corridor is different than living on, say, a light rail line or an electrified trolley line. The commissioners are interested in seeing making sure that the affordable housing bonus it works for not only the social housing developer, but other perhaps nonprofits and developers of affordable housing. We've requested that OPCD explain the criteria used for the selection of the neighborhood centers and how they drew those maps. And want to really understand how changes to the neighborhood residential zoning development standards supports production of family-sized housing and housing for people with disabilities. So all of those comments were raised last week and also referenced previous work that the commission has done, not only on making comments on the draft comp plan, but the work that this body has done in the past on promoting family-sized housing, accessible housing, and a variety of housing choices for people across the city. I'm going to turn it over to Olivia and then just let you all know that we're going to give you 5 minutes to review the materials that were sent out with today's agenda, just in case to refresh your memory or in case you haven't had time, given everything that's gone on in the last week, to take a review. So after Olivia finishes, we'll have a 5-minute reading time on the agenda.
I'll recap the discussion from the Housing and Neighborhoods Committee last Thursday, and note that this one was focused more on the specific draft zoning regulation changes as opposed to the exec meeting, which is a little more focused on the preferred growth strategy. So in the meeting, we did an overview of the commission's recommendations on the draft comprehensive plan as compared to outcomes in the draft zoning changes. And then commissioners at exec had also asked for a comparison of those draft zoning changes to the state model code. So we provided a sort of side-by-side comparison on some specific zone elements. And so a lot of the following points are going to be based on that discussion. So some of the specific zoning changes we discussed included floor area ratio and unit density. Commissioners noted they would consider suggesting up to 1.6 FAR. This is in neighborhood residential zone specifically. Like the state model code, which sort of ratchets up based on the number of units. So it's not 1.6 everywhere. It would just be for the highest level density, which would be 6 units. And they were interested in thoughts from others who weren't present at that meeting about that concept. We also talked about considering reviewing design standards around like balcony, stoops, entryways, and those type of elements through the lens of encouraging like interaction and community building. So how will these changes in neighborhood residential zones impact sort of community interaction as compared to a sort of single family style development, and how can the code influence that? The group also discussed the affordable housing bonus. We've noted appreciation that the bonus has sort of increased in its bulk and density from the original draft or original proposal. But we're wondering, if OPCD has any insight on how many units this could be expected to produce, and also curious if affordable housing organizations are happy with this proposal. And staff is doing some follow-up work to try to get to those answers. Around corner stores and neighborhood center retail, commissioners raised concerns about the balance of available retail space with increased housing capacity given the development changes that are proposed, and the potential displacement of existing small businesses as redevelopment occurs in the areas. In regard to the stacked flats bonus, had a bit of a discussion around that, but one of the outcomes of that discussion was that folks are glad to see this bonus included and would consider recommending that the city remove the 6,000 square foot minimum lot size requirement that goes along with that bonus, and sort of allowing the market to determine where those could go. In terms of building heights and neighborhood centers, the group discussed how each neighborhood center is really so different from the others. They also, some individual nuance is needed. And we discussed how previously the commission has recommended up to 8 stories be allowed in neighborhood centers to better support affordable housing building types. And so the conversation centered around maybe suggesting an affordable housing bonus of some sort that could encourage that use type in neighborhood centers rather than like a flat out increase of height across all neighborhood sectors. Around parking requirements, the group noted disappointment that these parking requirement changes do not go further to reduce minimum parking requirements across the board. And suggested that the group consider like reiterating the recommendation from the draft letter to remove parking minimums, but also perhaps including some middle ground approaches since that recommendation wasn't implemented the first time it was heard. Open space related conversation came up that there's a worry that the 20% requirement for open space, that's just sort of a flat 20% requirement, will be overly restrictive. And the group would like to discuss more ways to add flexibility and continue that discussion. And then they also touched briefly on inclusionary zoning because there was a recommendation in the draft letter to explore alternative methods of inclusionary zoning in neighborhood residential areas. And the group agreed that's a really interesting topic to discuss sort of overall citywide, but it's perhaps outside of the scope at this point to continue discussing it at this point in the process. I think, yep, that's it for that section. I'll pass back to you, Melissa.
So now we will take 5 minutes for all of you to review the materials that we sent last week. If you look in your email, I couldn't figure out how to attach it into the chat. So I resent the email from last week. It should be at the top of your email inbox along with a diagram that Matt Hutchins put together. So I'm looking at the time, it's 3:45. So we will start up again at 3:50 with a conversation based on the materials that you're about to take another look at. And then we'll move into a discussion around the zoning maps after that. And if you have any questions, feel free to pop your question in the chat, or if you're in the room, just ask me.
Vanessa, since missed both the neighborhoods meeting and the exec meeting, I have like a short list of things. What's the proper venue for me to add those things to this list here?
I think as we open it up, Matt, after this 5-minute period of review, we'll have a discussion because you're not the only one who wasn't able to join meetings last week. So we'll walk through and just sort of ask it, first of all, if there are any questions about the points that are made, and then open it up for additional comments to be added, if that makes sense.
Okay, sounds great.
Thanks, Matt.
And then Deanna asked if there's a particular order that we're going to tackle the topics.
The particular order, we will start with the November 5th recap, which is about the growth strategy, and then starts to get into some of the specifics. We'll basically follow the slides that Olivia and I spoke to, and then open it up to broader conversation if anything was missed or if there are any questions. despite being 4 years into it. About 5 minutes. Hopefully that was helpful. Olivia, could you please go back to the November 5th, the previous slide? Or the previous slide for that? Yes. So my proposal for how we structure this portion of the discussion is just to move through these 4 slides that Olivia and I spoke to, see if there are any questions or additions, and then open it up to a broader conversation. I know Matt has some things he'd like to add, and I'm sure others will as well. So are there reactions or questions to the slide currently in front of you, the November 5th Executive Committee recap? Lauren?
I appreciate that, we want to focus in on how our goals and intent for the growth strategy are reflected in the particulars of zoning around neighborhood residential, formerly known as single family zones, and then also focusing on these new neighborhood centers or the new urban hamlets, as we once called them. And I think it'll be hard for us to, like, that first stop point of a light touch on the growth strategy. But I wonder if there's ways that we can just kind of reiterate, like, this is the goal, this is the intent, this is what we said before. More people have more access to living in 15-minute neighborhoods and households of all types, something just like a goal statement. And then I really like the idea of using, like tables and graphic specific examples. They're saying, this is an opportunity to achieve this intent, this policy statement, and then really kind of saving our commentary on the growth strategy, on those policy statements for the draft comp plan that the mayor will transmit later in December. It might be on a different slide, but I really appreciate it. And I wasn't a part of the executive committee meeting, so thank you for the recaps, Olivia and Vanessa. Of like how do we kind of look for criteria and look for themes? I think that there's going to be, and I don't have any constructive ideas on it now, of how we address kind of neighborhood specific needs and frankly, I would look for opportunities to reverse historic inequities and underinvestment. And in some cases, overinvestment, like the light rail going through the Rainier Valley and really turning up gentrification and displacement, for example. That I want to strike a balance between, consistent thematic, data-driven criteria around how we establish zoning changes and implementation of this new kind of flavor, frankly, of neighborhood commercial. What does neighborhood residential mean for us? This is the first time that we are getting to move beyond single family zoning, in our in Seattle. Like, this is a new tool that we're developing, and I'm really excited for us to be able to contribute to this conversation. And I like the approach so far, and linking it back to our goals, but also being able to point out specific examples and kind of deal with the tension of when do we need to have a consistent approach. 10-minute walk from frequent transit is an example of a consistent approach to where we really need to deal with neighborhood nuances and unique characteristics. And so I think we'll work through that together in the coming meetings.
Thanks, Lauren. Any other thoughts on this slide before we move to the next? Can you advance us to the next, please? Thank you. Okay. Any questions about these comments? Or additions?
That's a clarifying question.
Yes.
Then it'll be you, Matt. When we're talking about the preferred growth strategy, this means that, we had fat lines on a map in the comp plan, and now we have more detailed zoning maps that kind of fill in those fat lines and bubbles, if you will. And so the preferred growth strategy is really like the zoning that accompanies the overall policy statement growth strategy. Is that what it, because I missed the overview of the preferred growth strategy in the previous meeting?
Yeah, the preferred growth strategy is really the policy that you find in the plan, and the zoning maps implements that policy. So the policy are comments such as, focus density and a 10-minute walk to transit and promote livable communities and walkable communities. And then how that policy level, how those policy statements get implemented is in part through the zoning maps where they decided to draw those lines. And then also in the neighborhood residential development standards.
Development standards, great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And I think Ed Hutchinson.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Matt.
yeah, I did. Let's see. I have some detailed comments about about the neighborhood residential, which I'll hold off for a second. But I did want to address this final point about how the NR zoning changes will support the production of family-sized housing. The diagram that I circulated via email actually breaks down the FAR, and for the most part, because the FAR is relatively high and lot coverage is relatively high, but the unit counts are not for the most part on 5,000 to 6,000 square foot lots. There is actually the finest you could really, if you built the biggest building but cut it into 4 units, you end up with fairly large units. So I think we will see quite a bit of what you might consider, for me, family sized housing, 2 plus 3, 4 bedroom, although for the most part townhouses. So I think that there is it does solve for larger units. And those larger units are going to tend to be townhouses, which in a sense is the most affordable or least expensive for ownership model. So that's solid. Thank you. The other thing I wanted to address is whether this works for the social housing developer. And honestly, the affordability bonus won't, because it's locked in at a very low AMI for 50% of the units. So I don't think that social housing developer is going to use this. However, some other developer on a much, much larger site, like a Habitat for Humanity, will. So I think that's good. But actually, the flip side is when you look at the over 6,000 square feet lots where you have a stacked flat and you can get to a 1.2, 1.4 FAR, that actually does produce both family sized units and at a really similar breakdown as the social housing developer. And so I think that the most powerful thing about the neighborhood residential, as it's written right now, is there are multiple pathways for affordable housing, for religious institutions, for the social housing developer, for townhouses and stacked flats. So there's multiple pathways for success.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Michaela.
Okay, I get to call myself. Hello. Is this where we're able to sort of talk about things that we noticed when we went to our open houses?
Sure,
Or-
although I'd suggest we hold off on the zoning map specific
Yeah.
conversations until the second part of the meeting, which will start in about half an hour.
Okay, so I just reacting to Matt's comments about the social housing developer. I'm not sure that they're looking at a format as small as 6 units. And do you know if that's correct, Matt?
I think that it's under, well, the over 6,000 square feet, you could get 9 units on that parcel. And so
And that's
that,
allowed under this new zoning.
yeah.
Okay.
So when you get to that density, and if you pull two together, then you're really looking at something that's quite comparable to their ideal pro forma. But I hope to have more discussions with him about this.
Okay. And my heart is always in trying to use our incentives and tools and levers to meet the need where the need is the greatest. And if you look at some of the current rents in the average apartment in some parts of Seattle, our market in terms at least of like 1 beds and studios is lower than 80% of AMI. And so the market in some ways is sort of meeting this income level that we used to think of as part of the housing need, the continuum that wasn't being met by our development community. And we know that 0 to 30% households and 30 to 50% households in this city, just with construction costs and land costs alone, that type of housing will not get built. And so I need to continually bring back in the households who are not served well within our economy right now, back into these conversations, because I think that's part of our charge here. And when we think about creating neighborhoods for all, it's not just about folks who are at like the 60 or 80% AMI income levels. And then one of the things about this piece that I did here at the open house was that, and Matt, you might know this better, but that you sit on this small developers, small unit development kind of advisory group that the city has. And the planners were telling me that y'all don't really think that stacked flats will get built at any like mass amount, partially because very few landlords want to own and operate like a 6-unit building because you can't reach economies of scale. And so then the typology, the tenure that we're looking at are homeownership units, and we're looking at condominiums. And there's still these challenges, and there's such litigation still, litigious risk that is involved with developing condos that they're not getting built. And so I had looked at the stacked flats option as the city's solution towards creating not just family-sized housing, but ground level accessible units for people with disabilities who cannot navigate stairs or who want to be able to age in place over time. And so I'm worried about that accessibility piece, particularly if the format that this is largely going to continue to produce are townhomes. We've been doing that and as a city already. And so I'm disappointed, although, I think the city's responding as to the extent that they can with the neighborhood residential kind of implementation. But I think some of the things that I'm bringing up are more broader market-based issues. So I'm not sure what suggestion I have for the city. It's just, I don't really know if this like incremental sort of density within our neighborhood residential zones is actually going to create homes that are accessible or homes that people can age in place in. So.
Thank you.
And I don't may not have been on point, but I'm curious what you think, Matt. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I think the big difference is that zoning isn't quite the barrier that it has been. And so there are still headwinds against stacked flats, many of which you mentioned, but there is going to be a market for these, but there'll probably be a lot more, they're going to be kind of unicorns. So, but it's not going to be limited by zoning. And I think that's what we that's what I would want to at least be the base case for the comp plan.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to suggest we move to the next slide when we are recapping, talking about the neighborhood residential development standards, which we've sort of already dipped our toe into. So now would be a time for questions related to what's on the screen, as well as additional items. Matt.
Okay, I will be. I'll be quite quick.
Don't be too quick. I'm trying to write it down.
Okay, but as an architect, the suite of design standards I know are exported essentially from like kind of a stripped down version from the low rise zone. So they have never applied in single family, the old single family zones. And so I think some people are worried about that, but architects are generally quite adept at this level of administrative review. It's a little bit of micromanaging. However, I also see that it may be a political necessity to really expand middle housing throughout the city. The one that the porch bonus, which I would generally love, except that the porches are limited to 1 story, and also there's a size limit. So you're going to end up, if used, you're going to end up with kind of like a 3-story building with a 1-story stoop. And we could be much more generous with that bonus and have that be a great benefit to both the people that live there and the curb appeal for the city. The how units are counted, we should maintain the current formula for rounding up at 0.85. Currently, if you have a 4,000 square, or if you have a 4,999 square foot unit or lot, you could only do 3 units instead of, if you have a 5,000 square foot lot, you could do 4 units. So I'd like to get the rounding bonus retained from the current LR zone. And then the steep slope exclusion limits the number of lots that can bump from 4 to 6 units. And that seems like a bit of a technicality, but it extends to tens of thousands of units. Some these are not steep slopes like like landslide prone geographic or geologic hazards. These are like little old retaining walls that might affect one property, but but then it is mapped as a steep slope, and then cannot be eligible for the density bonus, even if it is within transit and it's over 6,000. You'd only be able to do 4 units there. So it's eliminating the steep slope from the density bonus would actually unlock tens of thousands of lots. And I think the one thing that we haven't talked about, which is probably a good thing, however, Michaela, you're not going to necessarily like to hear this with regards to townhouses. The ability to do unit lot subdivisions on NR lots, similar to what happens when you're buying an independent townhouse. That's a really powerful tool, given that we're going to see a lot of townhouses, expanding that into NR.
Thanks, Matt.
I think I heard, sorry.
Go ahead, jump in.
I think, Matt, I think I had a conversation with OPCD staff at our open house that stated that they were expecting that unit subdivision to expand into NR, but I don't have that documented anywhere, so.
It's in the code. Or it's in their proposed code.
It's in the proposed, yeah.
So that's something.
That's something they are doing, yes.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Dylan has his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
Hey, y'all.
Dylan.
While we have Matt on the call, I was curious just to bring back up the FAR question. And so we've bumped up to FAR 1.2 up to 1.4 at a stacked flat situation on lots that are more than 6,000 square feet. But that's only for the stacked flats, that FAR 1.4. Otherwise, we're stuck at 1.2, regardless of whether there's 4 or 6 units. And I'm saying this for clarification and to verify I have that correct. And looking for kind of feedback on, what do we think as a group about the FAR? Do we suggest, like it's on the screen, that we just say 1.6 is what we push for and recommend in all conditions, or what is the nuance around kind of that upper FAR limit? Curious what other folks think, what Matt thinks.
I think stack flat needs an additional incentive. Whether 0.2 FAR is enough, I don't think that I think that the units get so big that there isn't an effective. The difference between 1.2 and 1.4 for something that is going to resolve as townhouses doesn't make a lot of difference. It just means more 3, 4, and even like a 5-story townhouse. It's like a difference that doesn't matter. Whereas it does matter for the stack flats. So I want to maintain a bonus that incentivizes stack flats. I don't think there's much of a penalty for having a slightly lower FAR elsewhere.
I guess one of my thoughts, Dylan, because you and I had talked about this at the open house, was this transition around neighborhood centers. And if you'll notice, a lot of the neighborhood centers are directly adjacent to neighborhood residential. And, there could be an opportunity here to allow a slightly higher FAR around those neighborhood centers as a way to sort of lightly densify. If they're not going to expand it to like a 5-minute walk, which, that's kind of how I kind of feel that they're really tiny and really limited and really hemmed in, informed by the typology in the neighborhood. But perhaps there's some sort of nuance here that we could look at in terms of a different way of thinking about the radius around some of the neighborhood centers. And then I saw that Deanna has a question.
Should I go?
Is it on this topic?
Yeah, yes, I mean, or related.
Yes, please go. Yeah.
Just to clarify, and again, I appreciate the collective, knowledge of this group and of experts like Matt to help us navigate and understand this for us that don't live and breathe this every day. For the stack flats, in the concerns about accessibility and vertical development, what are the requirements and or incentives that could be established, knowing that I can only imagine elevators adding incredible cost and management issues to that, but what are the vertical solutions to create accessibility vertically in these kind of constrained lot sizes with given the potential for increased FAR? And I'm thinking, to me, always going back to the, historic proven, development models around the world. Paris has a 1.5 FAR across the board with commercial land uses everywhere, right? The success of the Parisian model is creating axis at the bottom to create businesses, create jobs, right? And then the verticality, of course, with the benefit there that the lots are bigger. And our challenge in Seattle is our tiny, tiny lots where a 1.5, even if we're like saying a 1.6, say that we got to 1.5, that's Paris, but our lots are very tiny. And so we need the vertical support to create that accessibility. What can you help me understand either or what are the incentives or what the market challenges are to provide vertical assistance like elevators and such?
It's the incentive is height. 3 stories will never get elevators. 4 stories maybe. 5 is the break. 5 it's required. And then so anywhere between 5 and 8 is
It's
where
mandatory.
yeah. And so but we're never going to see it in for the most part in NR.
Okay.
Because at 32 feet there's the that's a luxury item.
I see.
But flip side, at 3 stories, any stack flat, a third of the units are probably, or 25% of the units are inherently accessible because they're at the ground floor.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go because it's just on this topic. I think the thing that we're not talking about is, or like the point that Matt just kind of made that it points to is allowing more multifamily buildings in places that are currently neighborhood residential, where the lot sizes are large enough to really be able to build a larger multifamily building. And so I think we can puzzle or think about it all we want, but if you're going to need to make sure at scale that you have accessible units, we're going to need more buildings with elevators in more places. So anyway, and I was getting some head nods here in the room from people. Dylan.
Two quick things, and one of them was something that Cecilia had brought up, and we have been talking about it. Matt just mentioned it as well, but just the stacked flats, and that inherently there is a third of those units that are going to be accessible at the ground level, and I think that is just a point that should be made, as we've already talked about, advising that stack flat that you don't have the limitation with only being allowed on 6,000 square foot lots, and the inherent sort of the lack of equity that brings to this accessible unit type. I feel like there's a way to kind of wordsmith our comment there to bring an accessibility point of view and consideration into how we comment on allowing stacked flats throughout more parts of the city beyond just the 6,000 square foot lots on smaller scale lots. And then my other question was just to follow up on what Michaela said, and perhaps this is we're not quite there yet. I don't know if this is a better comment for when we get into talking more about neighborhood centers. But we discussed, the idea of like a halo, kind of a transition halo around neighborhood centers, and there might be an opportunity to consider a bit more density, a little less than the 5-story of a neighborhood center, but a little more than kind of the 3-story of the NR zone, and perhaps there's like a 4-story LR2 radius around these neighborhood centers that allows for a little bit more density to come in, and also from the point of looking at it from a transition in scale and in density. I'm not quite sure how to frame that or whether that's even appropriate, but I did want to bring that up as something that I think we should consider and talk about as a group.
Thanks, Dylan. I'm going to suggest in the next 10 minutes, we move through the 2 additional slides that we have that are really just commenting on or building on the conversations that were started last week. And then I'm going to suggest at 4:30, we move into the zoning map conversation. And I'm looking around and kind of seeing some nods, more or less. Okay. We've touched on what I've heard. We've touched a little bit on the affordable housing bonus and the stacked flats we've talked about. Wondering if people have any questions about the bullets that are up on the screen. or additional comments regarding these points? Deanna.
Hi, and I apologize. I don't know, something's going on with my computer that my camera is not being enabled, so I apologize for not sharing my face. Um, the I had a question for discussion regarding, the kind of corner stores, neighborhood center retail, and again, I think unfortunately, and also it's just been a limitation on my personal time because I would have loved to dive into some of this with examples from around the world. But I still continue to be disappointed that there isn't such a strong nexus in framing our growth strategy with an economic development strategy and job creation, and making sure that our growth strategy is linked to creating, jobs and a proximity to them via what I was mentioning, the Parisian model in many European cities, models where, the ground floor is fully activated even in what would be considered the neighborhood residential areas around those places. And so I would hope, and I don't know if there's someone in the commission that either has the knowledge, capacity, or availability to look into our arguments to provide recommendations around these corner stores and neighborhood center retail feedback that we might provide with regards to that. I continue finding the discussion around, well, it's because noise and 7 to 10 open hours and those kinds of things just seem very just fear-based comments, not practical comments or ways to actually regulate that in practice. But 24-hour cities are the most successful cities, and creating opportunities for jobs in those locations, right, all across the city is also a very strong economic development strategy that we should be fighting for. So just want to put that in, and I don't know if we have the capacity or availability to look into that kind of comparative policy analysis with other cities around the world to inform what other cities do and why those concerns aren't necessarily manifested when implementing a zoning of this type, but just wanted to bring that up.
Thanks, Deanna. Dylan, I see your hand up. Or I did. And now it's down. So I would invite anybody who is part of the Housing and Neighborhoods Committee meeting last week. We did have quite a bit of discussion around the corner stores and neighborhood center retail, and I'm looking around to see if anybody would care to weigh in on that a little bit more. What I'm remembering, Deanna, is that we did discuss sort of should corner stores only be allowed on corners? We also discussed the noise and the fact that noise ordinances are primarily enforced on complaint driven. They don't have the noise police driving around. And I just invite CEO, I see your.
Well, I
help me
think
out, somebody.
part of the conversation around whether or not they need to be on explicitly a corner, and then also the hours conversation was to let business owners or potential businesses in the city determine what locations might be best for them to open in, and to then allow the community that surrounds them to kind of set the expectations of that business and to intervene as problems arise, rather than to limit what types of places people might think of opening from the start. And so it kind of, rather than setting ourselves up for a very specific, very constrained type of retail or small business, to leave the door open for people serving specific community needs in these newly open spaces. So I think, I don't know if that totally gets to what you're asking about, Deanna, but I think we were trying to frame it as why would you attempt to apply a blanket prescription for this to the whole city when every community that one of these businesses might be housed in might have its own specific particular needs.
Is there a concern on how many alcohol outlets might open on corner stores?
Well, that is certainly part of the fear. Yeah, I think some of the past experiences of corner stores in non-conforming uses is that they will have, a bar, or that they will have a line in the morning that's really long. And I see that Matt has his name tag on, so why don't you?
The way we're designing our cities now is, breweries and bars are opening in industrial areas instead, which are not easy to walk to. Like I was driving through, Soto the other day, all these little pop-up breweries and everything all the development's happening not in the neighborhoods. You have to drive to those now. So I don't know if it's a bad thing if a brewery or tap house was open in the neighborhood corner, but I could see where there'd be, pushback to that if that was the hours.
So the family-friendly thing is not
Yeah.
a bar on every corner.
Exactly. It's not a bar on every corner, but, for bar goers, it's not, the nicest to have it be in your industrial neighborhood. And I don't think the industrial folks in town want that encroachment either. So as we constrain our retail space to just the existing retail we've had for the last 20 years, we don't allow new opportunities for businesses of all types, including those bars. So not like I'm the biggest fan of bars here, but
You do work at
I do work at one.
I see Nick has his hand up and then Dylan G.
Yeah, I know we talked a lot about just the challenges that a lot of the corner stores are likely already facing in terms of feasibility and being able to actually get a business going. And so it seems like the approach that OPCD has taken is to really tightly regulate these and be very prescriptive about where they can land. And we can only speculate, that it's really to it's fear-based regulations that are being put in place. So not trying to disrupt sort of that mid-block feel of a residential neighborhood. So limiting them to only the corners and then restricting the hours likely to address any noise impacts. They did make some updates. I know initially they had more setback requirements prescribed, so that they've relaxed that a bit. But I think that as it's currently drafted, it does feel like it would really challenge the feasibility of some of these corner stores from happening in a lot of our neighborhoods. So if we're truly wanting to embrace this as an option for making our neighborhoods more livable, more walkable, it seems like we've got to be able to trust and kind of loosen things up a bit.
Thanks, Nick. Dylan, I think you're up next.
Well, Nick, I'm just gonna kind of what Nick said. I agree with a lot of the stuff he just said. So, but I'll just add one comment regarding, and this is kind of in response to what Danny was talking about with. I don't have a nuanced comment exactly regarding a specific city or a comparison city, but just in general, for something to consider is just the density and the number of people in an area, in a neighborhood, will economically limit the amount of small businesses that are going to open there. And so the idea that we need to provide additional regulation requiring a corner store to only occur on a corner or to only be open certain hours, there's going to be inherent limits of just the economics of the business that are going to, prevent an entire row of corner stores from happening in a given neighborhood. And I think that's the trick with Seattle, is that we have so much single family density that our low density limits, again, limit the ability for corner stores to happen across the city. They can only exist in certain areas and in certain numbers and still have an appropriate sort of retail catchment base to support themselves. So something to keep in mind. I mean, the economics of this are going to prevent an array of corner stores from popping up all over the place until we get appropriate density levels.
Dylan, thank you. I just want to jump in and say, if we could have an evidence-based kind of factoid to ergo say, given this and, why we don't anticipate kind of having this boom of like commercial, corner stores or other kinds of businesses popping up in neighborhood residential, is because precisely it's limited to the population that they would support. you should provide the opportunity for them to be open to whoever actually wants to provide it in a particular block. So that would be great to find an argument for to add into our recommendations. Thank you, Dylan.
Thanks, Deanna. Go, Matt.
Yeah, one quick thing, something we might look for. I don't know if this is gonna be easy to find, but if you look at like Google Maps in your neighborhood, you know, in the commercial areas, most of the storefronts close by 8, 9, definitely by 10 o'clock, including the restaurants. If we could find an easy way to prove that 90% of businesses close in Seattle by 10 o'clock, which I think would be pretty accurate to say, those like time restrictions especially won't be necessary because the market will just dictate no one goes out to eat after 10 right now in Seattle. So I think something like along those lines, more specifically, could like counteract the time restriction piece. Sure.
We can take a look at that and
Yeah,
see what we
maybe.
can come up
You
with.
guys can find something.
Olivia, do you mind advancing us? We've got one more slide, and then I'm going to suggest that we spend about 5 minutes on this and then move into the zoning maps. And I do want to recognize that this is drinking from a fire hose. So I thank you all. It's a lot to take in a short period of time. And I really appreciate you being willing to dig in. And we will do our best with the time that we have to provide some really hopefully value add comments to the city. So this is our last slide on the Housing and Neighborhoods Committee recap, where there was discussion started to getting into the specific zoning changes, which I think is a good segue into the discussion of the zoning maps. So first, I'm just going to ask if anybody has questions about the bullet points that are on the screen. I'm not seeing any questions. I do see in the chat that Deanna would like to make a point on parking and open space. And so then we'll move from the question into the more of the discussion. So Deanna first, then Matt Malloy.
Again, I think, it is incumbent on the Planning Commission to make a strong statement about our parking policy. Continues being, our comprehensive plan gives enough policy, support to do an integrated parking policy approach citywide. And because of how it's the jurisdictional authority over the different elements of it is the biggest barrier to making an integrated strategy happen, right? But I do want to make sure that whatever point we do make about parking requirements in terms of either, recommending remove parking minimums always need to come, and hopefully turning minimums into maximums, that would be really cool, needs to go hand in hand with on-street parking, regulated on-street parking policy, which I understand the reticence there is and the pushback there is from neighborhoods to regulate and have parking meters in neighborhood residential areas. But the only solution to truly push for a comprehensive parking strategy that limits our car dependence as a city has to encompass increasing regulated on-street parking in many areas, right? Particularly maybe neighborhood centers, right? And making sure that then you provide the kinds of regulation and incentives, and for some, right, of removing the minimums and hopefully at some point creating maximums. But I think it is incumbent on us to make that point, knowing that it's not going to shape probably any of this, but gosh, when are we actually going to have a comprehensive, on and off street parking strategy for the city to make us less car dependent?
Thanks, Deanna. Matt, then Matt. Matt M, then Matt H.
Yeah, Deanna, I completely agree about the parking requirements and hope we can work toward parking maximums. I have two things to say about open space. One, we didn't really dig into like what an alternative to 20% flat requirement would be. And I would like to hear more from like the architects in the room about what that looks like, but I think it would be good if we looked into options of like less of a requirement if you're within a 10-minute or 5-minute walk from a park. Someone said that I think briefly in our last meeting, and I wanted to echo that. And then two, one thing I'm gonna look for through my Get Engaged cohort is I have connections with the Forestry Commission and Urban Forestry. And if anybody has any materials about like trees and protecting trees for the 20% requirement, especially trees of a certain diameter, I know there's a limited amount of those inside of the city. I think maybe an additional requirement towards protecting trees of a certain diameter could be, I don't know if that's appropriate for the full comp plan, but I think that would be an interesting carve out we should look into as well.
I will just note on that point, something we haven't shared in the details of all this yet is that there is a new point system that they've created for trees. And so that's something I can try to dig up and send to you.
Was that in the previous meeting here?
No, we haven't talked about it in the meeting deck, just because it was like a level of detail we didn't get to, but there is a whole policy that is going around trees, so you might be interested in reading more
Cool.
about.
I think that'd be something I'd like to look at.
Matt Hutchins. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I did want to address the open space and also trees. The 20% open space requirement, I don't see as being too overly restrictive. When I was testing out the NR zoning for stacked flat buildings, it wasn't an issue even when I maxed out the footprint. So I feel like it's manageable. And I don't want to cut that down because we need to have some aggregated open space for trees to be able to be on site. So and then with regards to the tree point system, it's very similar to what's been already used in residential small lot now for 5 years. I think it tends to actually produce more trees on site, more new plantings of new trees than the current regime. Of course, in NR currently, we don't ask any, or only when you cut down trees. But this would be for all new development. So I think that actually is going to have some positive effects. And I also don't think that is too burdensome. It's definitely a new layer for neighborhood residential, but it isn't for other components of the city.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Michaela.
Yeah, I'll just say it does seem like the city is trying to balance a heck of a lot in terms of open space parking and the structure itself. And I don't think that we as a city should be prioritizing parking over kind of trees, open space, and the quality of the social connections that people can form by living in and around their house. So that's just kind of my off the cuff reaction to what I was seeing. I was like, boy, this seems like the site's really constrained. They're going to be balancing a lot of things, and they might have to make some concessions. And I sure would hate for those concessions to be made because they're trying to figure out where all the cars will go. And if they want to figure that out, if parking is valuable to the residents of those units, they'll pay for it. And developers might deliver it, but to require it and mandate it when there's so many other kind of community priorities that we want to see delivered in our neighborhoods seems just kind of crazy to me. That we're still having this debate about prioritizing that over trees and open space and community connection. And then I dropped in the chat just because I think we're supposed to say things of substance. Matt Malloy asked if there's any examples, and I went to the school session at my urban foresters might be my favorite kind of bureaucratic people. They're so fun to talk to. And King County invested Department of Natural Resources and Parks, invested in a report where they cataloged urban tree regulations across King County and pulled forward some takeaways in terms of what's working better than other regulations. That was a really interesting resource. And there's a lot of different techniques that folks are trying around this county to greater and lesser extent.
Could you send an email to me? I'm not sure.
I can do that. I'm gonna ask Vanessa to send it around via email.
I will send it around.
Okay.
I will send
Yeah.
it around. Nick is next, and then I'm gonna have that be the last comment on this for now. And just take the remaining time that we have to move us into an initial conversation on these zoning maps.
Is there
So,
going to be a chance to get something that did not make the list or not?
yes, I'm trying to keep us on time, and if you can just, oh yeah, I didn't see your,
When you finish.
let's go Nick, and then Andy, and then I'll try to move us on to the zoning maps. Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, I'll be brief. So the open space comment, I was raising that as an initial concern. Part of it was because in the Updating Seattle's Neighborhood Residential Zoning PDF, they actually put a statement in there that the 20% requirement was achievable under all scenarios, but required careful design in many situations. And it felt as though they were hedging a bit that this might be an issue for some properties to achieve the density that is envisioned with the 1110 implementation. And so I think, it might warrant some slight nuance to the open space requirements. And so that's where I was mentioning proximity to park, maybe parks that could give you some reduction in open space or elimination of the open space requirement altogether. Or we could think about deploying that type of open space around cottage housing and not really tying it to some of the other typologies potentially. So just more thinking, I think, might be warranted around the open space requirement.
Thank you, Nick. Andy, you had.
Okay, unrelated to anything you have there, because I want to make sure you finish.
Yeah.
Finish that. Okay. The concern is that with 20 or 30 neighborhood centers, increasing density in areas that were built for single family, that the water sewer infrastructure was generally old and generally not built to increase the density. I would like to propose a comment that asks OPCD to work with public utilities to identify existing water sewer capacity in each of those neighborhood centers, with the idea that some of them have adequate capacity so they could be encouraged for further development there. And the ones that don't have adequate capacity could then get higher on the list of what the capital plan is for utilities. The answer we got from utilities before I was really unsatisfied with, which was simply utilities considers the comp plan when they work on their capital plan. That just doesn't help us get more density in neighborhood centers. So it's more to encourage the density in neighborhood centers. They need to know where is it now feasible and where would you have to do more utility work to get there. So it's getting a comment in to encourage OPCD to work with utilities to identify existing and future capacity.
Thank you, Andy. I think when you brought this up before, we talked about staff doing some background research so that what we are asking for isn't actually already out there, so we sound informed. Okay. So as we're trying to juggle this, I was thinking that we would focus those comments around utility capacity for the broader plan itself that we'll be commenting on in the beginning of next year. That said, if you're suggesting that this be a specific comment around the establishment of neighborhood centers, what we can do as staff is, I honestly don't understand, I don't know off the top of my head, how Seattle Public Utility maps their capacity. I'm assuming they do to some level and that there is some coordination. So staff can look into that and then come back to this body. I want to make sure that any comments coming forward from the commission are well informed in what's already being done.
I just think it's a dead stop if they say we're going to do this neighborhood center and there's no capacity there. It's not going to go anywhere. So that's why to have it in front of them for their consideration, I think makes sense as a comment. So, okay, thank you. No, I'd be happy to hear more from staff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to suggest we move into the zoning maps. We've got, doing the math here, not looking at that clock is wrong. So we've got about 40 minutes before our public comment. So Olivia, would you be willing to share your screen, which you're already doing, but give a bit of an orientation to the OPCD website, which is really dense and fabulous. And I suggest everybody take some time with it because every time I look at it, I discover something else. So it's got a lot of information. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Olivia.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I'm going to real quick just share the link to the page that I'm on with you all. So if you're on your computer, you can explore it yourself. That might be a little easier than seeing it on this little screen. Yeah, so this is like an interactive map that OPCD has put out to help folks see the specific zoning changes for all of the different neighborhood centers. You can also see the proposed changes along the arterials. So high level citywide map right here, but I wanted to show you some features of the map that I found helpful. So one feature is down in the bottom right hand corner, there's this little bookmark looking type icon. That's handy if you want to just jump right to a specific little neighborhood center. It kind of zooms it in for you. And if someone mentions one by name, there's a lot of sort of neighborhood names in here that I'm not familiar with that I think, we were talking about around the office. We're like, we didn't realize Olympic Hills was a specific spot. And so we weren't sure where to find it on the map. So this is a handy way to just zoom around the different place types and specific neighborhood centers and areas. So that's a little feature to keep in mind. There is also some layers that you can turn on and off. This is maybe easier to see actually at the sort of zoomed back out level. But like I know, for example, we've discussed, which arterials are being covered. How does that relate to like the frequent transit map? They do have some layers you can turn on here, such as the frequent transit route map. And so you can actually see if you toggle this on and off, where these, upzoned areas of brown and orange are on the map and how they relate to frequent transit route map. So there's a few layers in there that you might want to play with. And then also while you're on this same page where this map shows up, you go up to their explanation section. They have links for each district to the specific maps that they're showing at all these open houses. And so that's kind of a handy way to get into some of the more detailed maps. And so if you click on one of these, it downloads an extra file for you. Which my computer is very slowly downloading right now. It doesn't love streaming and downloading apparently. And when that opens, I can show it to you. But that's helpful because it has really detailed photos of each of these. It also has an explanation of the different zones. It's going to be way too small for you to read here, but on the left-hand side, they explain what you can expect in each of the zones. So that helps you understand better what you're seeing when you look at each of these little community maps. So going back. I think, and there's also, if you have a lot of time on your hands, I'm not sure how much people want to dive into this, but there are comments that I currently have turned off. But if you zoom in on the map, you can see that folks have left specific comments all over the map about different areas, and you can see what those are. That's my quick little run through of what's in here. So now I think I'll turn it over. I'm going to have John talk about some of the comments so far around these. What's next?
Yeah, I just have a few slides as we enter into the discussion about zoning maps. I just want to let everyone know that so we will have a few opportunities for this discussion. We will be talking about it today, and then at Tuesday's executive committee meeting, OPCD will be coming to talk more about the criteria that were used for determining neighborhood centers. And then next Thursday's Land Use and Transportation Committee meeting will be dedicated exclusively to talking about the zoning maps. So I wanted to start the discussion by just recapping a bit of some of the comments that have already been made on both neighborhood centers and arterials that are reflected on the zoning maps. These are things commissioners have flagged or already discussed for consideration as we move into review of the maps. So as for neighborhood centers, there was a suggestion that the Planning Commission does not review the individual zoning maps in detail, recognizing that residents will be doing that and submitting their own comments about individual boundaries, which blocks and parcels should be included or not. Instead, the Planning Commission proposes to do a citywide review of the neighborhood center maps, looking for patterns and themes across these maps and commenting accordingly on a citywide basis. We suggest agreeing on a series of overarching criteria to ensure that the centers are mapped consistently and equitably across the city. The commission has stated that it would be helpful if OPCD could share their criteria for determining the maps and their framework for how the zoning choices were made within those maps. We have requested, or we would like to request an explanation for why specific neighborhood centers were added and why others were not. Specifically, it has been flagged that there is a lack of neighborhood centers in Northeast Seattle and Southeast West Seattle. Next slide, please. It has been said that there is a concern that the neighborhood centers may not be big enough to make a difference. And we want to ensure that we have sufficient land assemblage for large-scale multifamily development within those neighborhood centers. Question whether the proposed neighborhood centers are large enough to support economically feasible, affordable housing. Recognizing the challenge of balancing our anti-displacement goals with developing and incentivizing walkable 15-minute neighborhoods. There is a concern about displacement of existing businesses within the neighborhood centers, recognizing that these locations were identified based on existing businesses. And the question whether OPCD is creating sufficient zoning capacity for commercial uses on adjacent lots as the neighborhood centers get redeveloped. It appears that many neighborhood centers are going up to 65 feet, but only incrementally. And there's a need for more of a push for affordable units by going higher. And then lastly, the desire to be careful about the balance between existing neighborhood character and new density in these neighborhood centers. And then one more slide. I've captured several of the comments that have been made about arterials. Arterials are also shown on the zoning maps where those are proposed for rezoning. A comment that continued density and increased capacity for housing along hazardous arterials is problematic due to public health concerns and related concern that development along the arterials is limited only to the first parcel fronting the street. Recognizing that all arterials are not the same. This was said earlier in the meeting that light rail and low emissions bus corridor is different from a high pollution emitting arterial such as I-5, 99, or freight corridors. There was a statement that this specifically is a critical piece of how we bring an equitable lens to this review. People deserve a choice when it comes to where they live. Options available to low-income households should not be limited to housing on arterials. To the bottom, the suggestion was to ask the city to work with Seattle King County Public Health to monitor pollution levels along arterials, and recognizing that the Complete Communities Coalition has come out with a proposal to expand this arterials concept to a 5-minute walk from those arterials.
I think that captures it very well. Thank you.
So that's just a foundational piece of what has been said to date in several of our meetings. And I think we want to dedicate the rest of the meeting to just your thoughts on what you've seen so far in the zoning maps.
Thanks, John. So with the materials that we sent out last week, we had asked for commissioners, if you had the time, to take a look at one or two of the zoning maps of areas that you might be most familiar with, and come prepared to offer observations today to start our conversation around around specific examples, and then how we may elevate observations around specific areas of the city to develop overarching themes. So after I call on Lauren, I'm going to ask if anybody has observations to add. So I will, thank you. So first, Lauren, then Cecilia.
Thanks. Just a quick question, clarifying, John, so on Tuesday, who are the OPCD staff who are working closest on the zoning maps? I know that Michael Hubner came and gave like a overarching presentation, but who are the other staff that are the technical experts on this?
It'll be Brennan Staley.
Brennan Staley. Okay, cool. Love Brennan. So this is kind of just initial reactions, me processing. It is really helpful. What I'm looking at is the PDF of just the citywide zoning maps, and you can kind of just scroll through and kind of see everything, and that's been helping me kind of like try to see some trends. And the trends that I'm seeing are density along arterials, as was well covered here. But in the places that I know where there is kind of nodes of neighborhood scale commercial. So I live in Mount Baker, and kind of to the east of where the light rail station is, the QFC, MLK and Rainier Franklin High School, there's a little node at like Mount Baker Boulevard in McClellan where there's a Mio Posto, a Pilates place, a coffee shop. And that's one of the ones that I'm just most familiar with because I live close by. And so not that Mount Baker is becoming a neighborhood center in any way. Like all of South Seattle is pretty much urban centers now because they are around light rail stations. But kind of when I'm looking at the zoning changes, I see a lot of orange, which is the neighborhood commercial, where there already is commercial, and then a lot of brown surrounding it, which is low rise or mid rise. And which is good. I'm also still kind of trying to process when zoning changes are happening within urban centers. Like I'm trying to kind of like squint at the gray labels on the map that are like, okay, a lot of our urban centers are already neighborhood commercial. So what are we actually changing? When I'm getting back to kind of that Mount Baker example, it's like, okay, we are identifying where there is maybe commercial or retail activity happening in these lower density residential zones in our neighborhood. We're calling out that particular site or those particular parcels to kind of maybe legitimize that legacy zoning or those grandfathered uses. And then we're packing low rise or mid rise kind of around it, which I generally support, but I just kind of wonder, we're like, great, you already have a corner store, let's blow that up to potentially be six stories with more commercial under it, surrounded by lower mid-rise development, which is great, but I kind of just wonder about finding those specific parcels. Like Magnolia Village is another one where there's that kind of sweet little convergence of streets kind of in the elbow of Magnolia, and then so those parcels are now turning bright orange, bigger, more capacity, and then more density around them, which is great. The concept is great, but I also just wonder, are we wiping out those little small businesses that have been able to kind of carve out and exist in these non-conforming uses? Another one is like near Seward Park. There's kind of Orcas and Seward Park Avenue where there's a Third Place Books, a Cafe Vita. And, you know, that's the type of place, I mean, it's wonderful, but like, are we creating all of this development capacity in places that like, I don't really see those existing kind of smaller scale walkable, I can walk to the coffee shop or the market or the corner store. Like, I guess I'm wondering what that kind of like application of the orange, like neighborhood commercial zone at these like sweet little nodes in corner stores, is that going to destroy those places? Like, not that I don't want zoning, or not that I don't want density there, but it's just kind of like, oh wow, we've gone and we found these kind of little places that have started to exist, but like, are we upzoning them so much that you're kind of just incentivizing them being torn down in new construction at a much larger scale starting to happen? So I'm trying to kind of understand the succession of these places, and kind of what the kind of corner store, neighborhood commercial, the orange dots that are kind of intended to be the center of these new neighborhood centers. So maybe someone, an architect, someone who's clear on the actual development guidelines, like what does that mean? Is it supporting like adaptive reuse and like kind of like organically growing these places where we want to see commercial in historically single family areas? Or I kind of am just having a hard time like getting my head around like what that'll feel like. Because we have so few of them now, and it kind of feels like we've gone and we've just like identified all these like sweet little organic things that have formed, and I don't want to wipe them out. But you know, like what is the transition going to look like? And that's what I don't know.
Lauren, I think that'll be a great question for OPCD staff on Tuesday. Just as we're asking them about criteria, we can also be asking like how are you resolving the tension between increasing density and not wiping out these historic tiny little neighborhood nodes that, you know, how do you solve that tension? So I've made a note of that to ask, and let them know that we're going to be asking that in advance. That's a really good point. I see Cecilia has a comment or a question, and then Dylan G.
Yeah, just want to like reiterate everything that Matt and Michaela said about accessibility. Like this is just such a huge concern. And like just have been really disappointed about the lack of accessibility in this comp plan, and just like the going to previous comp plan events, just I think the lack of real thought that OBCD has done as a whole of like, where are all of these aging people and people with disabilities going to live? And so, you know, understanding that the minimum, like there's going to be most of the middle housing that we're adding is going to be townhomes. Just knowing that there's like a sunk cost that developers already have, but understanding, you know, they already have plans for townhouses that they can easily replicate, and knowing that like, even if we do as much as we can in zoning to increase stacked flats, like it will only be the bottom floors that are accessible. And so, you know, looking at these neighborhood centers, I think is a little disappointing at one, how small they are, but also I'm just like thinking about Matt's comment that it's 5 stories when an elevator is required. And, you know, these commercial zones have like a 5-story max, and then we drop down to 4 stories. And so I'm like, yeah, concerned just about the lack of accessibility that's going to be built in with these commercial zones. And then also, I think just want to echo Lauren's comment that I think it's bizarre that the, you know, commercial zones within the new neighborhood centers are just a fraction of these expanded neighborhood centers, and a little confused. I know the commercial zones are zoned to be 55 feet. I think that usually the surrounding is 5 stories. So I don't know if that equates to the same thing. And then like, yeah, so just really concerned accessibility, really, really frustrated with the narrow definition of transit corridors. And then one, just like last comment, looking at the, I think, Ravenna Roosevelt area, and I think there's a lot of these new or existing neighborhood centers, very close to, I don't know, get so confused with it's Roosevelt Urban Center, the next biggest zoning area. And they're so close to each other, but like the zoning doesn't actually connect. And I feel like that's, just thinking about expanding these neighborhood centers, it seems like that's like a missed opportunity to like, one, just have these like natural transitions. And I think that there's a few areas like this, I think in northern Fremont or Wallingford has like a new neighborhood center that is like so close, but like not connected at all to the urban center below it. And so, yeah, just really curious asking OPCD how they define these neighborhood centers and how if they're thinking about the flow between them and nearby urban centers or other neighborhood centers.
Thanks, Cecilia. So we have a Q, Dylan G, Michaela, and then Dylan S.
Yeah, so
Dylan.
yeah, my brain's been where Lauren was as well, just in talking about kind of what are they really proposing and as they identify neighborhood centers in Seattle that the locals, the neighbors already know exist, and now kind of the rest of the city will be more aware of. What are they doing here? And I think what I have understood the intent to be, and what a lot of advocates have said, is let's get more people into these areas that have your everyday, access to everyday needs and services. So the idea is let's bring more density in terms of people living near these existing businesses. And at the same time, a lot of what they've done, and not everywhere, but a lot of what they've done is they've gone and upzoned, from 40 feet to 55 feet. They've upzoned kind of the next increment. If these neighborhood commercial zones are at 55 feet, they've upped them to 65 feet. And so they've incentivized kind of a development to occur with that move. You can get additional density in terms of more units. But yeah, my question still sits with what happens when existing business that has created this neighborhood center, a third place, when that site is developed, where does that third place go? And there doesn't always seem to be a place set aside. And when I think of a place for that to go, think of an empty seat, an undeveloped lot, or a lot that is, say, a single family house. And I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see more intentionality set to identifying a modest amount of neighborhood commercial expansion in these neighborhood centers to ensure that there is that sort of empty seat idea. And just there's a little bit of room for neighborhood commercial to grow to adjacent lots, but not just to be torn down. And so they're not just seeing the existing businesses, torn down and then having to wait and hopefully, fingers crossed, coming back. But rather there might be a little bit of elbow room for development to occur and maybe these places to be able to move around. So that's kind of one of my comments that I'm curious about. I would like to hear what OPCD says. I've asked Nick Welch and asked him kind of about that. And their focus again was developing residential, and they don't really have a great response yet on kind of what happens to these existing businesses. And I'm curious if other people have thoughts on that. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Michaela's next, then Dylan S, then Matt H.
So patterns that I'm seeing when I scroll through all of the maps is just a tremendous amount of neighborhood residential zoning. This map that we're looking at on the screen, it's just a ton of yellow. And you can see we're hewing these kind of denser development types along our arterials and in really small spaces, in really small parts of the city. And so I think Lauren's hit on something that's really interesting of the city's going after places that add to the character and the vibrancy and the walkability of our communities and keeping so much. And what I'm observing is at the, you know, and they're doing that at the expense of those third places. They're doing that to kind of protect and uphold this pattern that we have of a tremendous amount of land dedicated to, I guess, middle housing that will be happening in the future. And so my vibes about this is it's not going far enough. And then I think you also hit on like the tension that we all butt up against when we're trying to plan for growth, which is we don't like change. We move to a community because we love it. And there's something about it that we love. And we worry about, we've seen what has happened, right? And we worry about the places that we love disappearing. But no community ever stays stagnant. And I watched this conversation unfold with the Ave during the MHA discussions, right? Like, what are we going to do there? We love this kind of like intimate, small scale, you know, commercial street. Folks in West Seattle were debating that at the time as well. And I will say that I've seen some success. I'm not saying that like all the developers would say it's the panacea, but if we care about neighborhood character or we care about facades, the Pike Pine Preservation Overlay has been sort of a model for protecting the facades while allowing new development to happen behind it. It's not like the end all be all, but you know, I think in some respects we're going to have to embrace the loss of some of the things that we love about Seattle to make room for our neighbors and more people. But I appreciate the questioning, and I think it's a really important question for us to be thinking about, which is how do we grow in a way that Seattle's still a place and our neighborhoods are still places that we love to be? Because the neighborhoods, in my opinion, are what makes Seattle so fantastic. So.
Michaela.
Yeah.
Dylan Stevenson. You have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that my comments or my observations are in line with what other commissioners have also said regarding the new neighborhood commercial zoning. It is a bit sparse, or more sparse than I was kind of anticipating, primarily being concentrated in these like formal neighborhood delineations. And for me, I think what was kind of, or what I was thinking about was quite curious, was this in conversation with the corner store markets or stores that could occur. So that is a type of commercial activity that I think does promote this kind of, fulfilling local needs at the neighborhood scale. But that's not really graphically shown in the map in of itself. And so it feels like any type of commercial activity is really just concentrated to these different just orange sections. And because we see, the upzoning of densification along arterial lines, if they're like just by it's graphically showing, if you're living along the lines in between these neighborhoods, it visually looks like you would have to travel far to access any types of these commercial activities. And so maybe this is more of just a question of communicating that. However, the corner store definitions, however it might be defined, but I feel like that's kind of a bit of a missed opportunity to show how you could conceivably live in a 5-minute walk type of community, have all your needs met. But I don't think that's necessarily portrayed in the map as it shows right now.
Thanks, Dylan. Matt Hutchinson.
Lower.
I think it's Matt Hutchinson, then Matt Malloy.
Matt Hutchins, yeah. Let's see. Yeah, I just wanted to make a point that I made in the chat, but make it on the record here, is that if 5 to 8 stories is really the sweet spot for capital A affordable housing, i.e. subsidized housing, that's really the floor in terms of the mass of the building in order to build those projects for the most part. I also wanted to say that really 5 stories is the key for accessibility, because that's when the elevators requirement kicks in, and so therefore all these areas around, I know there are a lot of them are on arterials, but the around neighborhood centers, it's really important to preserve both any of the, the sort of orange areas, but also those brown areas. Those are the LR3 zones, and those are the places where where the buildings that are going to get built will be 5 stories, will have elevators, will be much more accessible, and most often are going to be situated in neighborhoods where people that are downzoning from maybe an LR or an NR lot might be moving to. And so I think yeah, someone says, how can we grow the brown areas? But yeah, so I think it's just really important at this point to think about how we can articulate what the attributes of these zones are in a way that reinforces the value. And the other sort of connection that I wanted to make is, with the question of like, where do those new third places spring from if we're overzoning the places that where they've organically sprung up? That really is, is basically the corner store, or I should say like the small scale commercial, or, the ability to do some sort of a mixed use in or around neighborhood centers or in nearby neighborhood residential. It's really like that's where I would expect that next generation of entrepreneurial mixed use retail commercial spaces to spring up. So I have hope between Deanna and Dylan that we need to like expand or make those much more flexible so that they can serve, in to some degree, the displaced sort of neighborhood institutions that the rest of the growth strategy sort of focuses on.
Thanks, Matt. I'm hearing a lot of nonverbal agreement and head nodding. Andy has a comment.
Yeah, quick question, because I don't know. How are home businesses affected? Can you have, be an accountant with the occasional visitor? Can you be the artist studio, whatever? What's allowed and what's not allowed under current rules and under the rules that are being considered? Do you know?
It's it is limited. It's food, I think food and retail, but not services. So you can have a bakery, you can, make some goods, but you couldn't have a dentist office, for example.
So I mean, I was thinking, do you want to encourage some, home businesses that have a low volume of, an accountant sees a few clients or whatever? I mean, not something with lots of traffic and lots of parking, but do you want to encourage that in some of these areas or not?
Oh, absolutely. I personally think that you do. I mean, I don't know how many architects like started their businesses like in the basement. And how many tech companies started in some fabled garage. And it seems like
are you in your basement, Matt?
No, I don't have a basement.
Okay.
So is it allowed, or should we be asking it to be more allowed?
That's more.
Yeah, it does say in the code about what the uses are for corner stores, and that could certainly be widened along with the hours.
Okay, but I'm saying, an architect who's working at home, maybe should that be allowed? And do you need to put something explicit to it?
It's allowed, but you wouldn't be able to put a sign up. You wouldn't be able to do any publicity.
I think there is I do believe there are some provisions that exist for this already. Yeah. There are like size limits to signs, but I think you are allowed signage. I think they limit you to like how many employees you can have, how many vehicles you can have for your business. But I believe, especially during the pandemic, that these provisions were expanded for at-home businesses. So we could look up the specifics on that for everyone to see.
Okay, whether we ought to have any kind of comment on that, or if you think it's covered.
I think we first need to figure out what the existing rules are, and then we can discuss as a group. You all can discuss as a group.
Thank you.
Dylan G has a comment, and I think that's gonna, and Matt and Lauren, So Dylan, Keith, Matt, Lauren, and then we're, because we do have public comment and we have 11 minutes left. So
I'll be quick. I'll be quick. But my comment was just, I think what Matt was saying, it was something that started coming to mind as well in my mind. And I think it's something we just need to dig into further to understand what's currently allowed in terms of at-home businesses, because I know there are provisions for that. But looking at the corner store as that sort of empty seat, as that sort of development or that opportunity for, some of these existing businesses to be able to have a home when their sites get developed is a good one that I think we should dig into further and make a point about and use to back up the sort of liberalizing and reduction of regulation on these corner stores. It's a really, there's plenty of cities that don't have this sort of use division that we've imposed with the idea of only a place where you only have residential. So the idea that we can have corner stores in our residential is a really great opportunity, and we need to make sure we're not overly constraining it so that it never actually happens. So just making that comment.
thanks, Dylan.
Yeah. Dylan, Matt, echo the corner store liberalization. One thing I noticed going through some of the comments of the zoning map, and no one else mentioned this, we kind of talked about it in the broad stroke sense, but a lot of comments are about like eliminating donuts, which is kind of superficial and a little bit like, but like if you go South Seattle or even in North Seattle, there's like these spaces completely surrounded by an urban center and they're still neighborhood residential. And I think we could maybe wordsmith something where, if you're within a neighborhood center, urban center, if there's 5 blocks that would connect them, if you were to do some kind of low-rise 3 or neighborhood commercial, connect them, kind of like fill in those gaps more in a systematic way. Because right now it just kind of seems like there's no real rhyme or reason to where things end. And so kind of blending that, and like we said, blending down from the neighborhood centers to neighborhood residential, connecting urban centers and neighborhood centers together that are so close, I think is something we could look into more.
Thanks, Matt. Lauren and then Deanna.
Yeah, I'm just gonna keep picking on Mount Baker because it's my neighborhood. Michaela, what you said about, it's like we went and we picked out all of these places where these organic kind of neighborhood commercial activities, and we just upzoned those sites as opposed to, and then Matt kind of added on to say like, well, do we want to foster neighborhood commercial activity here? What is a cluster of sites around an intersection? All 4 corners of an intersection get upzoned instead of the nice little, think of like, if you've ever been to Volunteer Park Cafe, it's like, great, well, someone converted that house to a commercial business and like, so let's just upzone that one lot that house is on. Well, what about all of Aloha up to Volunteer Park?
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like, okay, we need to not just go and decimate these places that did kind of in a non-conforming way form. And I'm just continuing to look at Mount Baker. And if you know Mount Baker, there's Franklin High School right across the street from the Mount Baker Light Rail Station. There's an Olmsted Boulevard, Mount Baker Boulevard, that connects from the orange dot, like down to a high school, down to the light rail station. And that is all yellow still. What is brown is, the block off of the 14, which is on McClellan and kind of going up to Hunter Boulevard. I'm really interested to talk to Brennan on Tuesday to be like, okay, well, like, how can we expand these kind of the hearts of these neighborhood centers from just being the sites that already exist as commercial to be more like, how do we foster this as a node? And then to Matt's point, how do we think beyond like to right now, which is like where we're going and finding where all the corner stores already exist. What are the corner stores of the future? Where do we want them to be? And how could we maybe think about low-rise zoning or mid-rise and like designating more frontages of streets around schools and parks? Mount Baker example. A beautiful Olmsted Boulevard. The houses on that boulevard are multi-million-dollar homes right now, but what if more households could fit in those homes and also be walking distance to schools and to light rail stations? So thinking more systematically about the types of places that are wonderful community assets that more people can have the privilege to live near. And then where do we want the next generation of corner stores and neighborhood nodes to pop up? And how do we identify those conditions now to then bake some of that flexibility into the zoning. So we can continue this conversation later, but those are all the thoughts that were triggered for me.
Thanks, Lauren. I think our last comment is from Deanna, and then we're going to move into public comment.
I will defer it to whenever we're meeting again, but I think we need to set time to have this last discussion around the Brown. Be a little, allow for more time for it, because I can already see, for example, an easy overlay is where's the bicycle network and the bicycle, kind of like class 3 bike boulevard type roads. Those are the natural, obvious locations where the Brown could expand, and where these kinds of nodes that Lauren's talking about are already semi-identified. They have the right street typology and type of use. So more to come, I guess.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being intrepid for these 2.5 hours. Lots of stuff to talk about. Staff will summarize this in briefly, not to the level of minutes, which will come out later and be approved on the 12th, but we'll get you a summary before that. And I'm going to turn it over to Kayla.
And we are going to move on to public comment for some folks who've been patiently waiting for hours. Sorry, not very formal and official of me. So I'm going to walk through some instructions really quickly. The commission provides time for public comment at all of our meetings. A reminder that we don't hold public hearings, and we are an advisory body. We make recommendations to elected leaders who in turn make the actual decisions. Individuals who make comments to the commission should remember that the mayor and the city council make the decisions. We encourage you to provide your comments appropriately to them. And I invite any individuals in the audience to offer public comment. We ask that you keep it to 2 minutes. And who are you? Did you end up signing up? No.
You can have them.
And if you want, maybe come to the table so that there's a mic that picks up your voice. Yeah. Thank you.
Take Matt's spot here. So first of all, I want to say I really appreciate everyone's comments today. That they're very edifying to see this conversation is going on, all these changes. And there's concern about what happens, what the city is proposing to do. So I really appreciate the concerns. I think what I have to say probably would fit right in with what I have to say, which is my number one concern is about parking. I've lived here for 40 years in the city as an architect, doing mostly multifamily housing and some single family. And I know the neighborhoods pretty well, at least where I live. And what I would say is that having any parking requirement at all seems to be a concern or a loss. Mm-hmm. And what I'm thinking is, if you go to any new developments that have a main house and additional development, there's almost zero green on those sites. They're all paving. Due to parking. People want parking, and have to require is, I think, a loss. And I think there's opportunities with this new rules that have come down from the state to put in place real opportunities for an affordable mode of development. It would say, for example, be two duplexes on a site where you don't take up all the space with parking and so on. So some thoughts about that are, right now, when you have the result of a house with 2 ADUs on a site, the parking required is 1. And when you go to say there's 2 parking required for dwelling units, you're actually increasing the parking requirement for the number of dwellings. And at the same time, when you do that, when you add a curb cut, you're taking off essentially half of a parking stall from the street. You put in two curb cuts, then you've taken off 1 parking stall from the street. You end up with more development costs, especially if they're all townhouses with on-site parking. You have less actual green space. You have less opportunity for direct access from living space to open space on the outside, ground level housing. You have obviously more paving, you have, you're encouraging, when you encourage on-site enclosed and covered parking, you add development costs. So it incentivizes a more expensive form of development. And finally, if we truly want to advantage for sale housing for working wage residents, we need to think of every choice to reduce costs and encourage less parking on site, particularly for those who more and more choose to live without a car altogether. So those are my thoughts. I have this written out. Forward to you, Vanessa.
Excellent. That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because did you catch his name? Did you catch your name?
Yes.
Joe jumped you after, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hey, Joe.
Hey, Matt. We'll meet again.
Did you get any email public comment during the meeting?
I did not.
Okay. Does that conclude our public comment?
That concludes our.
Okay, all right. I just want to appreciate everybody for sticking around till the bitter end. It's 5:30. And with that, I call the November 14th, I close out the November 14th State of Planning Commission. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks all.
Great job. Yeah. Good stuff.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I got something.